Hello, my name is Michael Burns, and I condemn all acts of political violence. Now, we heard this phrase from politicians.
There's no place in America for this kind of violence, for any violence ever, period.
Media figures.
Across the board, there has been strong condemnation of any form of political violence.
Even comedy musicians in the wake of the attempted Trump assassination on July 13th. Things got so serious that Kyle Gass of Tenacious D basically lost his career and apparently his friend and creative partner of 30 years over a joke about the attempt on Trump's life.
Don't miss Trump next time.
Now, we're not here to analyze the assassination attempt, largely because it's already been done to death and because we've already moved on to more important things, like talking about how the weird Republican vice presidential guy didn't bang a couch. But maybe did. But we do want to step back and talk about the term political violence. Because even though lots of people are using the term, it seems like no one really knows what it means. And in using political violence largely to describe lone wolf attacks on politicians, we might be obscuring its more insidious and often invisible forms happening all around us. Which can make us blind to the fact that America does not in fact run on Dunkin', but instead runs on structural political violence. So grab a donut and whatever new sugar-filled drink Dunkin' has on special as we dive into the meaning of political violence. Now we'll start with this question. When everyone from politicians to guitar comedians are condemning political violence, what are they actually condemning? Well, put simply, political violence describes acts of violence carried out with the intention of achieving political goals. This applies to everything from wars between nation states, to police brutality, to ethnic cleansing, to riots, to attempted coups. According to an essay in political studies, political violence is defined as hostile, aggressive, or violent acts motivated by political objectives or a desire to directly or indirectly affect political change or change in governance. Acts of political violence can be committed by a state, like pogroms, or by non-state actors, like terrorist attacks, or Ryan Reynolds, because he's from Canada, but he lives and mostly acts in America, which makes him a non-state actor. Also makes him not a very good actor. Shout out to everyone that liked, Deadpool and Wolverine, but it made me angry. The Trump assassination attempt is being framed as an act of one-sided political violence carried out by a non-state actor. And whether or not it was politically motivated is another question. As of the filming of this video, they still don't know a lot about the motivations behind the shooter's actions. What we do know for sure is that he gave a lot of money to OnlyFans, and the last thing he Googled before doing the thing he did was porn. And folks on the right were quick to pin the blame on the violent rhetoric of the left.
As I've been saying, they've consistently ratcheted up their rhetoric, especially as November's election looms.
It's like, you pick a team though. Is the left violent? Are they a bunch of soft cucks? Are they dangerous? Are they snowflakes? Just pick a team. Now, Republican VP nominee / Yale grad and hedge fund guy who masquerades as a country boy, J.D. Vance, tweeted that
the central premise of the Biden campaign is that President Donald Trump is an authoritarian fascist who must be stopped at all costs. That rhetoric led directly to President Trump's attempted assassination.
While some blame the left's rhetoric for recent political violence, studies in both Reuters and the Journal of Democracy have found that in recent years, political violence in America has become an overwhelmingly right-wing phenomenon. Reuters points out that 13 of the 14 fatal political attacks carried out since January 6th have been committed by right-wing assailants. And a January 2021 American Perspective survey found that white Christian evangelical Republicans were outsized supporters of political violence, which I think means basically every dude who goes on the show The Bachelorette is probably a fan of political violence. I know that I've referenced that show another time recently, but I'm mad at the producers because I think they hate Jen the Bachelorette because they just gave her the worst guys ever. If you're a producer of that show, what are you doing? Now, many of the recent studies on American political violence have paid particular attention to the events of January 6th and their aftermath. And violent rhetoric has only ramped up with another election cycle. And again, to our overseas audience, you're welcome for giving you another reality TV type election cycle so you can just point at our nation and laugh. But the right hasn't always had a monopoly on political violence. In the 70s, it was most often carried out by left-wing activists. The key difference, though, is that they largely focused on destroying property. According to Rachel Kleinfeld, there were many bombings, but usually at night or after called-in warnings. The goal was not to kill people, it was to affect decisions by policymakers. In contrast, much of today's political violence is seen in individual acts in which people are shooting neighbors over imagined political disagreements, carrying out racially motivated mass shootings, or murdering protesters seemingly on impulse. And according to University of Maryland criminologist Gary Lafree, incidents like this began rising in 2016, right around Trump's first presidential campaign. Now, of course, these events and the rise of political violence in America more generally should be taken seriously. But when we focus on these events, are we missing the bigger picture? So we know that the types of political violence most prominent in post-2016 America are often politically motivated attacks carried out by a single individual against those of an opposing ideological, racial, or gender identification. According to the previously mentioned essay in Political Studies, in order to establish that attacks constitute political violence, we should look at perpetrators' stated aims. But doing this can muddy the waters, because for example, when the Weather Underground blew up buildings and then put out statements announcing their political motives, it was of course a straight up overt act of political violence. But other instances can be trickier. Think about John Hinckley, who did try to kill a sitting president, but his motive was getting the attention of actress Jodie Foster.
When did you first realize the connection between the Hinckley in the letters and the Hinckley who shot the president? Well, how many Hinkleys do you know?
I think she eventually knew who he was. I don't think they fell in love. For at least two reasons. So even though Hinckley committed violence against a politician, it's hard to call this political violence. Also, in fairness to Hinckley, he got out of jail recently, and now he puts out songs so he can make the world a more peaceful place. The example of Thomas Crooks seems to fall somewhere in the middle because, he clearly tried to assassinate Trump, but at least as of right now, he doesn't appear to have harbored any explicitly political motives or aims. But in focusing on individual acts of violence, we miss out on the full scope of what political violence really is. Now, scholarly analysis more often focuses on larger scale phenomena like riots, coups, rebellions, ethnic cleansing, and genocide carried out by states, political parties, and terrorist groups, just to name a few. And this is important as recent discussion is focused mostly on non-state actors carrying out violent acts, which tacitly ignores all types of state-sponsored political violence, something America just so happens to be really good at. If political violence was an Olympic category, we'd have so many medals and a lot of blood on our hands. One legendary example was fueled, at least in part, by the desire for low-cost bananas. Let me know in the comments what you think about bananas. There's debate on whether this is a good fruit, a delicious fruit, a useful fruit. I'd love your opinions. Now, the company that's now known as Chiquita, once United Fruit Company, was based in Guatemala, where its incredible wealth fostered serious U.S. financial interest. But after a democratically elected leader started agrarian reforms that transferred some property from landowners, including United Fruit Company, to impoverished laborers, the United States got involved to protect their precious potassium, because God forbid some impoverished laborers had some land that they could use. That'd be terrible. This meant planning a coup led by an exiled Guatemalan army officer who'd already tried and failed to do a coup to a previous government. Now, using a mix of public relations, propaganda, psychological warfare, a US-backed military operation, and the installation of a CIA-backed military government, the United States helped return Guatemala to a more business-friendly political situation. The international press called this economic colonialism, and in 1999, President Bill Clinton formally said, "Our bad," to Guatemala. Guys, it's crazy that America it just does all this stuff all the time. And I'm not saying that it means America is necessarily bad, but we don't learn about this in schools. People don't talk about it very much. We've done some sus stuff. And because of that, I don't think that America is brat. I still don't know what that word really means. An interesting side effect of this coup is that a young Che Guevara was actually living in Guatemala at the time and said that experience helped convince him that armed struggle was necessary in the face of imperialism. So I guess we can thank the CIA for all those cool Che posters and t-shirts that we used to wear back when I was a kid. But according to most definitions of political violence, the American-backed coup in Guatemala absolutely qualifies. We have a nation state using psychological warfare, propaganda, and violence to take down another country's government in pursuit of its own political and economic ends. And to be clear, this is hardly the only time. It wasn't that America did this like once on accident and it was like, baby, that's not me. I'm never going to do it again. I'll do better. No, I was doing it all the time. The United States has been involved in violent regime changes all over the world. And the hits don't stop there. President Obama famously carried out 542 drone strikes during his tenure, killing an estimated 3,797 people, including 324 civilians. Now, this allowed him to make good on his campaign promise to bring the troops home while continuing to perpetuate targeted violence in the Middle East. And never one for false modesty, Obama allegedly told senior aides, "Turns out I'm really good at killing people. Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine." Yeah, we didn't either. For anyone who was voting in 2008, it was a very different time, a very, very different vibe, back then. And now things are different. I'm not saying they're better or worse, but I'm saying they're not better. So if the United States has a long history of state-sponsored political violence, then why do politicians and the media focus on individual acts of sometimes dubious political intent? In other words, why are we cool with Obama, killing civilians with drones, while a guitar comedian can't make a joke about a former president getting shot in the ear? We can better understand this through considering the humble iPhone. It's something that millions of us use every single day, and which increasingly mediates our entire social, economic, and often sexual existence. But for all the time we spend clutching our little addiction machines, we don't often consider the economic exploitation and violence that enables us to have these types of consumer goods. For example, I'm sure we've all heard the reports about how the factories in China where they make iPhones and Apple products had to install suicide nets at the bottom because the workers needed suicide nets, But we're able to use these things without any serious, if any, reflection on the offshore conditions that make them possible. Just about this super simply, it's like we use a bunch of technology and products that make our lives easier, and we are completely disconnected, maybe alienated, from the material conditions that produce them, even when those conditions can involve exploitation, violence, and suicide nets. And something similar happens with state-backed political violence, because we can unconsciously enjoy favorable economic and social conditions that are enabled by that very violence. Now, in her recent book, Kyla Scanlon points out how the potential for political violence is actually a factor in the strength of the US dollar, writing that the dollar is an inflation hedge, backed by nuclear bombs, F-22 fighter jets, aircraft carriers, and millions of American military personnel. So this sort of means when other countries sort of hitch their currency to ours, it's not just because we're a beautiful, wonderful, melting pot democracy. It's because we have the biggest military and will kill anyone who messes with us, so that political stability keeps the economy a little more stable, I guess. But this offshore political violence doesn't always stay offshore. In fact, it might be a contributing factor to the increase in homegrown political violence in the US. As historian Kathleen Belew explains in her book, Bring the War Home, American military members who participate in violence abroad can bring those experiences back home with them once their tours end. She tracks how soldiers coming home from Vietnam created a new wave of white supremacist groups and militias. She writes that one leader in this movement, Louis Beam, urged activists to continue fighting the Vietnam War on American soil. When he exhorted readers to bring it on home, he meant a literal extension of military-style combat into civilian space. He referred to two wars, the one he had fought in Vietnam and the white revolution he hoped to wage in the United States. By Belew's analysis, it's no coincidence that some pretty horrific events that happen within our borders, like the Oklahoma City bombing, are perpetuated by ex-military personnel. And to be clear, she's not saying in the book, and we're not saying right now, that veterans as such are bad people or more prone to violence. We're simply saying that the conditions of war and violence that soldiers participate in can really affect one's psychology, leave them with PTSD, a bunch of other things that, left untreated, can create some bad conditions. And we also see a version of this in the military to police pipeline, and nearly 25% of American law enforcement officers are ex-military. So while the types of violence that ensure America's global power remain invisible to most of us, those who carry it out overseas come home with the potential for committing stateside political violence. So at this point, we have a better understanding of the broad scope of political violence, how it functions, and how it's a necessary part of our political system. But of course, a lot of structural political violence either isn't discussed or is even seen as moral in so much as it serves a larger purpose, stuff like spreading democracy or fighting against the threat of communism. Put differently, it seems like political violence doesn't count as political violence when it's being carried out by the state, while political violence carried out by non-state actors is always morally reprehensible. Another way we can think of this is that, you have objective violence built into our systems, which is justifiable. But then you have subjective violence, which is violence carried out by individual actors, which is immoral. This is why the FBI can be justified in their killing of Black Panther Fred Hampton, but then protesters spray painting property or burning a flag are seen as inciting violence. It's like FBI, good job, protesters, boo. We've seen the sentiment in the reaction to the Trump assassination attempt, with politicians and especially liberals strongly condemning all political violence. And many of us, might counter this with a kind of yes and approach. We could say, yes, the type of renegade political violence so prominent in America post-2016 is absolutely abhorrent, and the political violence carried out by state-sponsored assassinations and military juntas are also bad. But, and we're just thinking out loud here, guys, is it possible that in some cases political violence can be justifiable, maybe even moral? Now, before you clutch your pearls or dislike this video, let's just consider a couple of examples and go from there. In 1859, abolitionist John Brown attempted to take over the town of Harper's Ferry, and in the process captured slave owners, freed slaves, and engaged in a deadly firefight with local militias. He was eventually captured, tried, and hung for charges including conspiring with enslaved people to rebel. Hey, for those of you that really fetishize, colonial, early America, all that sort of stuff, it was a country where you could be hung for conspiring with enslaved people to rebel. In other words, it was illegal to free slaves. Now, clearly, Brown committed politically motivated acts of violence, right? We're not going to debate that. But let's consider another example, the Haitian Revolution, in which a slave uprising led to the ousting of French colonial forces and the founding of a new state free from slavery. And it involved the deaths of both rebelling Haitian slaves and European colonists from France. Fun fact, if you didn't know this, after the Haitian Revolution, France charged Haiti a large debt for loss of property. What property, Michael? What property are they talking about? People. They were talking about people. And, Haiti has had a lot of problems in the modern era, and you can tie a lot of that back to the fact that they were in debt to France for loss of property. Now, structurally, both of these examples might qualify as radical groups using violence to attack the economic and social foundations of dominant state powers. But considered from an ethical perspective, both also involve fighting to dismantle the institution of slavery. And seriously, if you think that that's bad, no worries, okay? Just leave us a comment that says, actually, my name is blank and I think freeing slaves is bad. Just leave it right there. So following this, could we ever say that violence by a non-state group directed against the state is morally justifiable? And again, guys, we're just thought experimenting. We're just doing philosophy together, okay? Don't freak out on me. Well, philosopher and psychiatrist Frantz Fanon considered this topic from the perspective of colonized individuals. Now, in much of his work, especially The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon considers the effects of colonial violence on colonized individuals and the ways in which these systems fundamentally dehumanize them. Now, an effect of this is that in their dehumanization, the colonized subject learns that violence is power. Fanon writes that for the colonized person, from birth it is clear to him that this narrow world, strewn with prohibitions, can only be called in question by absolute violence. And if you learn that the only way to question the world or criticize it is via violence, the same violence used to perpetuate your own subjugation, well then violence is going to be the only way that you can conceive of to change your conditions. In other words, to decolonize. While acknowledging that this is often a necessary and politically effective act, Fanon notes that without a larger political goal, this can turn into an endless cycle of violence. So it's necessary that the ultimate aim be to create a world fully devoid of colonial violence, white supremacy, and other forms of oppression. According to Josh Pallas, Fanon urges that mere violence is not enough to construct positive new reality. The inclusion of all of the people into the creation of the new political reality is of the utmost importance to ensure that strong foundations are set for a coherent and sustainable state. So the aim here is placing conditions on violence so that it can meet its political aims without becoming gratuitous, which we know from history is often easier said than done. Now, this can help us reframe a lot of what we've discussed so far. Because if we follow Fanon, we see that violence begets violence. And if forms of subjectivity are established via political violence, then violence becomes the primary way in which political power is wielded. I mean, think about the Che Guevara example that we talked about before after the American-backed coup in Guatemala. After experiencing that form of violence, he was then like, oh, I guess the only way to fight imperialism is to use violence to dismantle it, But hey, we got cool posters and t-shirts. Now, while not endorsing violence as such, from Fanon's perspective, when it's used by colonial subjects to liberate themselves from colonial powers, a la the Haitian Revolution or American slave revolts, it can be justified as it's being used to dismantle oppression. So is there anything we can learn from the recent response to the attempted assassination on Trump and the accompanying condemnations of political violence? As we've seen, these reactions and the larger discussions about recent political violence in America have considered this phenomenon as an individual act carried out by non-state sponsored actors. But of course, political violence has a much broader definition and a more complicated history than the recent discussions indicate. And it could even be argued that political violence is the sort of original sin of the United States global power. The uncomfortable reality seems to be that politicians and media figures don't actually have a moral problem with political violence. They have a problem with political violence not formally endorsed and carried out by the state. In other words, they want to make sure that the state keeps its monopoly on political violence. And by keeping our eyes glued to stories of heinous individual acts, we're conveniently distracted from the equally, if not more heinous violence being carried out by the state at home and abroad. This might be why many of the politicians and public figures who were incensed by the attempted Trump assassination have been silent on the US-backed war on Gaza, or state-sponsored sweeps of homeless encampments, or police killing black people with impunity. Many of those same politicians have only spoken out when potential violence has to do with their preferred political candidate or party, even freely engaging in speculation about violence against their opposition.
If she gets to pick her judges, nothing you can do, folks. Although the Second Amendment people, maybe there is, I don't know.
And while we very much do not dig violence, especially political violence, we're just a bunch of soft little guys over here, and we hope that we can get through the rest of this election cycle without any further bloodshed. It would be really naive of us to act as if this can all simply go away if we just treat each other with performative respect. Because when political violence is baked into the fabric of our very nation, it seems like it's always going to find ways to rear its ugly head. But hey, at least the corporate media has something to talk about, and we have something to tweet about, and we can continue to create content for the cycle of advertising and stuff like that. Pretty cool, right? Great. But let us know what you all think. This is a complicated issue, so we'd love to hear some nuanced and complicated thoughts from you all. A huge thanks to all of our patrons. Your support means a lot, like a whole lot. Like, it literally helps the channel stay alive. If you want to be a part of our channel's lifeline as well, there's a link in the description. It'll take you to our Patreon page. You can see what's good over there, but for most of our levels, you're getting videos early with no ads, extra audio and video content, access to our Discord server, and more. If that's not something you're up for, totally fine. I get it. Thanks for watching this far, and if you haven't already, please subscribe, like the video, and leave a little comment. It helps a lot. In the meantime, in the words of someone who was assassinated, give peace a chance.